There's a caregiving crisis in Texas, according to families and advocates for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They're asking lawmakers to increase funding for certain long-term care services, specifically to help pay staff. As Investigator Avery Travis reports, this session, they feel like the legislature is listening.
Texas has several programs funded by Medicaid, but also state dollars that allow for different types of living arrangements and care and allow people to stay in their homes or in the community. Demand for these programs is high, with a notoriously long wait list. But even still, families and advocates say the programs have historically been underfunded.
We knew at 3 months old that Todd was going to need 24/7 supervision for the rest of his life.
A cancerous tumor and a stroke as a baby left Glenn Bradley's son Todd with brain damage, vision loss, and some issues with fine motor skills.
You have to start preparing and making plans for what that's going to look like when they're older.
Now an adult, Todd lives in a group home in the Dallas area with a few other men and receives what are called home and community-based services.
It's in some cases having to help feed. It's having to help bathe.
Bradley says it's allowed Todd to find independence. But in the last few years, they've noticed staff turnover and even a shortage of caregivers for his home.
He developed relationships with his caretakers, and then they're gone.
The base wage for caregivers funded by the legislature has only increased from $7.84 to $8.11 an hour since 2015. This session, lawmakers are considering the most significant increase in years, funding a base wage of $11 an hour.
So we're all fighting over the same workers.
Denise Gassmeyer's company, Champion Services, runs the group home where Todd lives.
For almost 20 years.
She says all of her revenue comes through the state program. So when she increased pay at her locations to $12 an hour, that had to come out of money for other services and operating expenses. Without an increase in legislative funding, she believes it'll be tough to stay in business.
33% of all my shifts are open. I don't have staff to fill them.
It's a trend across the state, according to the Providers Alliance for Community Services.
That means at any given time, 1 out of 3 homes doesn't have regular staff on site, meaning the staff that are there that have maybe already worked 12 hours, 18 hours, they can't leave. There's no one there to relieve them.
Executive Director Sandy Frizzell-Batten acknowledges that puts caregivers and clients at risk of mistakes. They want to see an average pay of $15 an hour for all caregivers.
They are a part of humanity.
For Gassmeyer, it's personal. Her son also needs this kind of care. It's why she started Champion, and why both she and Bradley testified at the Capitol for a rate increase.
His way of life is really being threatened at this point, because without those frontline workers there to take care of them, I mean, you can't provide a home.
Right now, the House version of the budget does provide enough funding for that $15 an hour average wage that PaxTex is asking for. The Senate version of the budget looks a little different. It actually has what's called a floor, or a base wage, of $11 an hour for these kinds of staff and caregivers. We know we've heard from lawmakers all session long, saying that there are lots of competing interests for the budget surplus that the legislature has this year, so they want to be smart about how they're doling out money so that it's sustainable. The budget is still going through the legislative process, so we'll be sure to follow it. For State of Texas, I'm Avery Travis.
A battle over diversity programs on college campuses.
When you have compelled speech, you do not have free speech.
We sit down with the senator who's leading the fight, why he believes Texas needs to shut these programs down. Momentum at the Capitol to limit local control, how new legislation could roll back rules to protect workers.